This is the first book in a long time, or maybe even ever, where I closed it and felt this kind of overwhelming swoop of my senses, almost as if like a tsunami had been brewing inside me and it kind of imploded to go, or exploded to implode within, and I just felt overwhelmed. And I didn't want to like bawl my eyes out or anything, but I just felt myself well up, kind of thing, and just kind of like, yeah, completely taken aback. I think I was. It was. I think partly through relief, but also just the unutterably depressing beauty of the piece. I would say it was magnificent, and almost as if as the title suggests, the silent cry within myself kind of got a chance to breathe, kind of thing. Hi, I'm mckay, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Kenzaburo Oe's The Silent Cry. I think this is the first piece of Japanese literature I've featured so far. I have done the graphic novel Uzumaki by Junji Ito before, but I mean, that's not literature. This is power. I would say it's an incredible piece. It's masterful. Exceedingly grim, I will also mention, if you're not into, or if you're looking for something that's existential but not necessarily really kind of delving deep into the, I would say, horror of existence, essentially, then maybe keep this one on the back burner until you're ready for it, because it was really kind of hypnotic, but at the same time unsettling as you read it. You felt like things were going to get or that things were grim and they were only really going to get grimmer. And that's pretty much what happened throughout. Although there were moments of like pure excitement and real intrigue, and you wondered where it was going, and you were aroused to find out. At the same time, you kind of knew it wasn't going to go too well throughout, mainly because of the way the book's set up. So to briefly go over the plot, because there's quite a few things I could mention here that I believe will spoil it too much. So instead, what I'll try and do is relate it to why I personally found it to be so moving, by relating it to my own experiences, because I do believe that that's what this book will do for you if you were to pick it up. And hopefully, as this review goes on, that will be explained and demonstrated. But basically, it tells the story of, in the first person narration, of two brothers. One of them, Mitsu, who, by his own account and of others, is quite an ugly individual who is virtually blind, but I mean, he can still see, but only out of one eye. And that's due to a childhood incident that he's basically got one completely dead eye kind of thing. And that's actually, just to briefly go over that, it's something in literature for some reason that it seems to crop up a lot, actually, blindness. With the title Blindness by Jose Saramago, but also that it seems to be a running theme. I mean, Dante obviously was blind. In The Tunnel, we have a blind character. There's loads of references to, and it goes back quite a lot to, I can't remember. There's a quote that demonstrates it quite well. That's typically kind of slipping my mind at the moment. I'm trying to think of it. It's something about like those who refuse to see or something like that. I'm not remembering it. Let me see if none are as blind as those who will not see. Essentially, if I can know we got there. I might have cut that because that was embarrassing. Anyway, yeah, that whole thing with blindness throughout literature is quite a fascinating topic, and I believe so for myself because it seems to come up in a lot of things I write as well. I'm not really sure why. It even goes all the way back to like Oedipus and what he does to himself at the end of his story, despite everything he knows, and that is a premonition that is given to him, he still blindly goes into his own narrative like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and so that he therefore blinds himself because he cannot stand the world that he has seen, kind of thing. Mainly because he was so blind to it through his own behaviour, things like that. But anyway, to skip over that, I just thought I'd briefly mention it. And yeah, Mitsu is the narrator of the story. And really it kind of relates his relationship with Taka, or Takashi, his brother, who's been away in America for a while. I mean, just the whole beginning of it kind of gives you this idea of where we're going to be heading down towards it. I will briefly go over that because the opening line is quite fascinating. Each chapter is titled as well. The opening one is called In the Wake of the Dead. And it starts, awakening in the pre-dawn darkness, I grope among the anguished remnants of dreams that linger in my consciousness, in search of some ardent sense of expectation. So it's already got this kind of like hint that the main character is a bit disillusioned with life and he's in a kind of existential crisis, but also that he's not really facing reality. So he's kind of lost, awash a kind of, I would say, depression of sorts, but also when life becomes quite stagnant and difficult to comprehend, you can kind of go either inward and insular, or you can kind of disassociate as well, which is something I relate to quite a lot. And there's those moments where you feel like you're kind of just drifting through life, almost like a zombie-esque, and you don't really know how to get out of it. Everything feels kind of misty and opaque. And for our main character, Mitsu, it's kind of understandable as it goes on. I mean, there's a lot to cover. That's the thing. It's like there's certain things I want to mention, and there's others that I don't, mainly because I don't want to spoil it, really. This is one of those ones where I do think details, whilst symbolic and quite often ambiguous throughout the piece, I don't know, I felt like they have a stronger sense when you don't really know what's going to happen. But I will mention a few brief things that happen at the beginning, just so you can have an idea. So we meet this character of Mitsu, and we get an immediate impression that he's not quite satisfied with life, to put it simply. And he's literally sitting inside a cesspit where they're going to be building a pool inside his home. But at the beginning, it is literally a pit. And he sits inside it on his own, middle of the morning, and he's kind of ruminating on his existence, essentially, and of what it means to him. And he's planning on, or he's arranged to meet up with his brother who's been away in America. And it's almost like after reading the piece, you kind of realise what it all meant. But at the same time, it's a very beautiful way to start things. And a little bit like Poe, I would say. It kind of reminded me of Pit in the Pendulum, which is a great short story about kind of punishment and awaiting punishment and death. And I felt like Oe probably took a little bit of influence from Poe over the years. I can definitely feel little kind of inklings towards it. Him and Dostoevsky, actually, the themes and subject matter that throughout this book are rife, constantly reminded me of Dostoevsky. But it's also got a very Japanese kind of leaning towards it. There are notions of shame, which is a big in their culture, and of what that can mean for a person and their life. But to get briefly back to the story, our main character, Mitsu, he is married. He has a child, but by his own admission, it is a retard, an idiot that he consistently refers to it as. And it's currently in an institute. They have basically disowned it as parents. They don't really know what to do. Mainly because it's almost like it doesn't really exist in a way. And that split from reality at the beginning is definitely present in our main character. I don't think he can quite deal with what's going on. And his wife, Matsumi, I think her name was. She has dealt with it basically just by drinking. There was a kind of link to her history or familial history where her mother was an alcoholic. And although she feels like she can control it, at the same time, she's definitely relying on it to try and numb her mind and get through the process. And although there's a closeness between them as a married couple, there's also quite a big distance. And obviously this brain dead or brain damaged child is kind of literally sitting between them. And as much as they want to approach it, it's almost as if they need to grieve it through silence, essentially. And like the title suggests, the silent cry, whilst I didn't actually like it as a title at the beginning, I thought it felt a little bit like over the top, like it was kind of suggesting that it was going to be very melancholic, I suppose, but in a way where you can predict it being too uplifting towards the end. I actually thought the title fitted it perfectly because everyone's kind of living with this ache, essentially. Actually reminded me a bit of Harold Pinter's The Slight Ache, which is a play where it has similar themes, I'll say. And yeah, they're going back to their hometown, which is a kind of it's a small little village just outside Shikoku. I'm probably saying that wrong, but that's kind of a big city in Japan. They're going back there because they have land that they're selling, and there is a Korean kind of supermarket, Goliath kind of guy who's basically setting up these different supermarkets all over. And basically they're just going there to settle the contracts for the land and the ownership and all of that kind of stuff. And it's a chance for them to rekindle and to get back together. And we learn that his brother has been in America fighting, well, in a play. He's an actor of sorts, but he's also a kind of political activist against the right. And I mean, the main things you learn at the beginning are the dead baby of our main character. Then his best friend has, which is referenced to quite frequently throughout the story in much the same manner a lot of the time, which I found quite amusing after a while, because one of his best friends, who he actually translates with, our main characters are like a translator of English, different books he translates, and his friend was the same, but he hung himself, and he did it by painting crimson over his face, paint, and hanging himself, but not before sticking a cucumber up his anus, which is frequently mentioned throughout the story, pretty much the whole time. Like whenever it's spoken about, he just adds in the whole cucumber up the arse thing. But he hasn't actually told anyone else that that's what happened, or at least the characters in the story. It's kind of his secret that he knows. I'm not sure how he knows it, to be honest. I'm forgetting. I'm sure that was referenced, but yeah, he knew, but the rest of his immediate family didn't, and they never come to find that out. And also we learned that his brother caught gonorrhea quite early on when he was in America. He was planning on going his own way when he was there anyway. He was going to, basically ditch the theatre group and just travel around America and see what's what, and kind of do his own thing, really. And one of the first things he ends up doing is going to the ghetto, I think in New York, sleeping with a big black prostitute. And when he does that, he gets some venereal disease, and he actually meets, I believe, the friend who I was just talking about of our narrators. Whilst in America, he happens just by chance to bump into him whilst he's in a chemist, hoping to get the medicine he needs to clear his problem, shall we say. It is set around the 60s, the 1960s. Throughout the whole story, but a century before comes up quite a bit as they actually enter the small village and the valley and start to mingle again and to get to know each other essentially and catch up, they constantly reference what happened 100 years before when there was a kind of uprising, a revolution of sorts. And I suppose around the middle point, I was kind of wondering where the story was going. I didn't quite realise that was going to be so significant in a way. And what Oe manages to do is just blend all of these things and weave them so brilliantly. It was almost like having a familial tree, but overlapped with not only a country's history, but their history as well. And they kind of intermingled, and there was all these kind of connections going on and double layerings of meaning and significance and symbolism there, very, very delicately veiled, but there, very much so. And I thought it was masterful, actually. Fucking depressing, I'm not going to lie. It was heavy. I mean, those things I just mentioned, the gonorrhea, dead baby, well, not dead technically, but dead in the brain baby, and the best friend who's just committed suicide. They're just your little tasters. That's the beginning, basically. As we progress throughout the story, things only really get worse. There are moments of excitement, as I mentioned earlier, where history starts to repeat itself. But that's when the real existential genius of the whole thing starts to come out. There is a theme of guilt as well that goes on throughout the whole story. And that has a lot to do with the inner turmoil of the human condition, essentially, and of having to live with your own proclivities, your own leanings, your own biases. There's touchings on racism, of group mentalities, tribalism, empty revolutions as well, where you look at it in a kind of ironical way, where in the modern day it doesn't quite, or it cannot possibly mirror what happened in the past, yet it can still repeat itself. And to backtrack on the whole theme of guilt, what I actually found so relatable in that is how, whether or not you're ever found out for doing anything, or whether you have to live with a secret, I still believe that guilt follows you around, and you actually end up in a self-prophesizing way of bringing about your own punishment, essentially. And that's kind of exactly what certain characters of this book do. It's almost as if they cannot really live with the things that they've done in the past. And so when he actually knows of his own history and of the people in his family, he over-glorifies them. He makes them martyrs in his own mind. And he wants to repeat what happened with them because he relates to it in such a certain way. And what those questions really bring up, especially like when you, for me, what I was reminded of was my own family, and then thinking of how most of the men in my family seem to die off and around their 60s. So that got me thinking about that. Then there's one woman, I believe, on my mother's side who went insane. And for some reason, that always sticks in my brain, like I'm going to go nuts at some point. So this whole idea of your genetics kind of being within you really connected with this whole existential problem throughout the whole piece. And that's just my initial first impressions as well. I've read this most of last night and finished it off this morning. And yeah, it's, there's little other moments in it where he's looking at a painting that depicts hell. And there's a kind of softness to hell at some points as well, or a kind of there's so many bits in it. You've got this hermit character who's been living in this kind of grove area for most of his life, and he's completely mental. There's the fattest woman in Japan who has a condition where, although her body doesn't yearn for any food due to some accident, her brain keeps telling her to eat all the time, and she kind of becomes like a martyr for this whole village, and they kind of help her out to be this fattest woman of Japan. But at the same time, it's almost as if she kind of redeems them in a weird way, or she plays that kind of glorified victim, I suppose. And the brother as well. I mean, he's a fascinating character. He kind of you can kind of see things that really do relate to our times as well, where big-headed moronic tyrants with penchants for violence are being glorified and looked up to, when people who actually know what they're talking about, who are well read and are educated and actually, studied the fields in which they are experts in, are shunned, ignored in favor of biases and of feelings over facts or of scientific based knowledge. And yeah, it's fascinating it's really fascinating to read. Brings up a lot of your own kind of inner truths that you don't often want to look at, I would say. That's what makes it a difficult read, not in the sense that it's too convoluted or non-poetical, because it really is throughout. But at the same time, it is awkward and unnerving, mainly because of what it reminds you of, and of your own kind of inner truth that you don't quite ever want to speak about. And this kind of the pain of the human condition overall. I thought it was one of the most powerful pieces for that. And the way it kind of weaved it inside this kind of web over a web. It was majestic, I found, really mystical. And I still feel it kind of shooting through me. The depictions of snow in particular towards the end or the latter half of the novel, he gets it really inside you, and you feel it on the kind of surface of your skin as well as on the interior, some might say soul, or of that kind of dread, I would say. The fear of death a lot of the time, but at the same time of being able to face up to your own death, or to at least your own fears and things like that. And what you are naturally going to lean towards in your life. There's definitely confrontation, I would say, with your own inner conflicts and within the characters throughout the piece. It is fucking depressing. I will say that again. It's like, I can't stress how grim this is at times. It's fucking grim. But beautiful. It's amazing. I thought it was stunning. And thank you to Jose again for the recommendation. I'd listen to any more suggestions you may have after reading this. It was beautiful. Other books that might echo it a little bit, I'd say The Tartar Steppe. Definitely. That was another life kind of existential and of the human condition, a piece of literature that perfectly depicts those things. It's up there with that. I'm not sure which I prefer. I mean, because The Tartar Steppe was more allegorical, whereas this feels more connected with political history of Japan and of familial kind of relationships and things like that. But on a certain level, they definitely have similarities. So I'm going to leave out the comparison in that regard of what I favour. But at the moment, I definitely felt a bit more like blown away by this, because it was just, yeah. Once it gets its hooks into you, which is about the halfway point, I couldn't keep my eyes away from it. And that was despite how at times I felt reluctant to, because you could tell that there's some really fucked up, grim shit coming down the road reading this. But you want to know it anyway, and you relate to it more than what you'd probably be willing to admit in polite company. So, yeah, that's where all the awkwardness comes from in this piece. And I thoroughly fucking recommend it. So, thank you very much for watching this. I'm mckay, and I'll see you next week. Bye.